It's really a wonderful pleasure to welcome her back to the University of Michigan, where she got her PhD in 1989. Mary is very well known for having done pioneering fieldwork in Sumatra. Now, it was in the sense pioneering in the sense that Mary was trained in the sort of the classical tools and classical topics of anthropology, did her field work with one of those sort of topoi of kinship studies, the Karo Batak of Highlands of Sumatra, who are famous in some circles, or were famous once in some circles for the elaborate marriage system and exchange system that was one of the sources for the work that made Claude Lévi-Strauss famous in 1949 Alimentary Structures of Kinship, and was one of the places that was supposed to have a circulating connubium. Did turn out not to, but it was a good idea. So the pioneering part was not that, but the fact that she managed to work in this kind of classic fieldwork situation and make it new, make it fresh, and put the Karo Batak right in the center of conversations about modernity, postmodernity, colonialism and postcolonialism, trauma, history, and memory, and all of which she has conveyed with a deft hand and a truly sort of artful and craft of writing. She's one of her hallmarks is the careful craft with which she writes, which is exemplary and which I wish were more common, because it'd be a lot more fun to read in my profession if everyone wrote as wonderfully as Mary does. Mary Steedly is now professor of anthropology at Harvard University, and I want to get to her. So let me just very quickly touch on a couple of high points of her publication record, which many of you already know. Her sort of breakout book was Hanging Without a Rope, Narrative Experience in Colonial and Postcolonial Karo Land, which came out in 1993 from Princeton, and was awarded the Victor Turner Prize for Ethnographic Writing because, indeed, it's beautifully written. She has she also wrote sort of a sort of classic state of play article on the anthropology of Southeast Asia for the annual review of anthropology, and the last couple of years have been this sort of burst of things coming out. She co-edited with Patricia Spire Images That Move. It came out of one of those enviable School of American Research seminars, where you get to live in this sort of Santa Fe paradise for a week and then pay for it by producing a book. But at the same year, she also produced Rifle Reports, a story of Indonesian independence, which has come out from California, which is built around the memories of Karo Batak's as they look back to their participation in the Indonesian War of Independence. And intriguingly enough, I think a lot of us are looking forward to the next book, which is based on her very long experience with the Citadel, the military school in South Carolina, which I believe Mary knows inside and out. So she's got a book manuscript in preparation called Citadel Culture, Educating Citizen Soldiers for a New World Order. But that is yet to come. So today we're still in the land of Karo Batak, I believe, and I'm very happy. Please welcome Mary Steedly.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Webb, in particular, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to recognize a few familiar faces back from my grad school days and subsequently as well. Webb touched on what I think is a kind of key element of the talk I'm going to give today, which is fun. I really think that there's not enough fun in ethnographic writing, and one of my aims is to try to put it back, even when dealing with subjects that are deeply serious. So, eating an elephant. First of all, thanks so much to the center here for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk to you all today. This presentation is drawn in part, but with a slightly different spin from my book, Rifle Reports. The book is about nationalism and the Indonesian struggle for independence from Dutch colonial rule, which took place between 1945 and the end of the Pacific War and 1950, as these events appeared from the perspective of a peasant community on the outskirts of the nation. The project took me back to a place, as Webb suggests, where I'd lived for 3 years, a decade earlier, the province of North Sumatra. Specifically, it's well, that shouldn't be there, sorry. Okay, for those of you who are not that familiar with Indonesia, Sumatra is the large island to the west of Java. And the part of Sumatra that I focused on was the northeastern side below Aceh, of what used to be called during the Dutch days as East Sumatra, but is now North Sumatra. So this is a close-up of that area around the lowland capital city Medan and the nearby upland district of Tanah Karo, or Karo land, which is relatively close, about 50 kilometers uphill, as they say. Medan, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is, I believe, now the third largest city in Indonesia. It's an enormous, sprawling, dysfunctional, multicultural mess in many ways. A very interesting, exciting city to spend time, but not one where efficiency is particularly valued. But just to give you a couple of pictures of what the area is like, this is the road from the city up into the Karo Highlands. There's another shot of the highlands. So that should just give you some idea of the place. Now, these were the setting of my first book, Hanging Without a Rope, in which I explored the possibility of constructing a local history, a local Karo history refracted through stories that people told of encounters with spirits. In that earlier sojourn in Karo land, I was fascinated by the vivid stories of life during wartime that punctuated the everyday conversations of older Karo women and men that I knew. These were told virtually at the drop of a hat, to my research team and to each other, to strangers on long-distance bus rides and over tea and cigarettes in street-side cafes, to their kids, neighbors, and kin, in veterans groups, church meetings, and other public gatherings. But there was little recognition at the national level of their part in the independence struggle, and few of the educated younger generation of Karo showed much knowledge of or interest in their stories. This is a picture that I wanted to share. This is my little brag. I recently was contacted by this man who is a kind of major figure in Karo cultural activities in Jakarta, who asked for a copy of the book. I sent several copies, and he shared them with some of my informants. This is one of them, who commented that, in a kind of overly flattering way, that now what we did won't be forgotten. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it certainly felt good to have someone think that that was worth doing. With the 50th anniversary of independence taking place in 1995, it seemed important at that time to record these accounts, these stories that people told me, especially those of women whose contributions to the independence struggle remained almost wholly unrecognized. And you can see some of women's activities there. And this is a picture of two of the women who were nurses, actually. Between 1993 and 1995, my research assistants and I interviewed around 120 people about their experiences during the independence struggle. They included former soldiers, militia officers, and government officials, as well as teachers, church elders, choir directors, midwives, nurses, entertainers, businesswomen, spirit mediums, and housewives. But the majority were small-scale farmers and traders. About 3/4 of them were women. Here are a few pictures. The original for the illustration on the cover of my book. Some were people that I'd known for more than a decade at the time. With others, I had only the most transient of contacts. All but a few were ethnically self-identified as Karo. Many now lived in or around Medan, the sprawling capital of North Sumatra province, with their children or grandchildren. Some had moved to Jakarta, but most remained in the towns and villages of the Karo Highlands, like these two women. Most were from the so-called generation of 1945, who came of age during the independence struggle, and so their stories were no doubt colored by memories of youth, just as their experiences of the period were tinted by the enthusiasms and hopes of that adventurous life phase. I collected local histories, self-published memoirs, photos from family albums, like these. Mimeographed testimonies and historical accounts, old recordings of song, patriotic comic books like this one, and much more. I read faded typescripts and listened to family stories, hoary jokes, and second and third hand yarns swapped in casual conversations in coffee shops and on bus trips. I haunted record shops and used bookstalls, attended Independence Day celebrations in the Karo Highlands, explored archives in the Netherlands and in Jakarta, and was fortunate to receive from friends and colleagues copies of documents I never would have discovered on my own. Putting these materials together has been a long and laborious process, during which I've been grateful for the help and patience, as well as sometimes the impatience of many friends and colleagues. Indonesian national independence was declared on August 17, 1945, just days after the Japanese surrender that ended the Pacific War. Exactly 5 years later, on August 17, 1950, the Republic of Indonesia achieved full international recognition of its political sovereignty. Between these dates, Indonesians fought against Dutch efforts to retake their former colony after 3 brutal years of Japanese occupation. Most Indonesians today refer to this period as the struggle for independence, Perjuangan Kemerdekaan. It was a time of military mobilization and political indoctrination, sporadic battles, diplomatic negotiations, and low-intensity guerrilla warfare. It was also a time of social turbulence, euphoric aspiration, and internal violence, in which Indonesians struggled not just to defeat the Dutch, but also to move into a future that for many was barely imaginable. This was the first successful war of anti-colonial liberation in post-World War II Asia. Because of its historical precedents and predominantly nationalist rather than Marxist internationalist orientation, as well as its success in welding a nation from diverse and dispersed populations, as you know, some 13,000 islands, several hundred linguistically and culturally differentiated groups, in a relatively short time and in the absence of some pre-colonial entity on which to base its territorial claims, Indonesia became a model and inspiration for theories of nationalism and state formation as well, from Clifford Geertz's work on new states in the 1960s to Benedict Anderson's on imagined communities in the 1980s. During this time, there's been a proliferation of local histories, memoirs, and biographies written by and about veterans and political leaders of the struggle. Nevertheless, most academic studies of the struggle, both in Indonesia and elsewhere, have continued to attend to a small segment of the total population, the total national spectrum, focusing geographically on Java, the nation's demographic and cultural center, politically on urban elites, and experientially on men. Without denying the centrality, both before and after the fact, of Java-based elite men in the project of post-colonial state formation, Rifle Report shifts attention to one of the neglected parts of that spectrum, rural women and men in the Karo Highlands of northern Sumatra. Inspired by a political rhetoric that equated independence with such tokens of modernity as electric lights, tractors, and glass windows, Karo villagers embraced the nationalist cause with an enthusiasm, perhaps unexpected in a once stateless hill people who had long been, in James Scott's phrase, adept at the art of not being governed. Ebenezer Sinuraya, a former company commander in the largest of the Karo popular militias, explained it like this: With us, he said, as soon as the gong of independence sounded, it was forward march right away. We didn't know what had to be done, but we stepped right up. We stepped forward even if we didn't know anything. We stepped forward. Later, from the inside, then we could fill it in. Otherwise, what is independence? What is independence? At the time, probably 80% of the Indonesian people didn't understand what independence meant in political terms. They didn't understand. How could they understand independence? They didn't even know how to write. But as soon as there was the proclamation, they joined right in. Whether it was because they were afraid or whatever, well, that's possible too, but it wasn't 100% because they were afraid. They really wanted to take part. The Karo enthusiasm flourished despite the privation and terror that ensued. Karo land became a battleground and a sea of fire as Dutch troops gradually gained control of the district. Yet the reason for this enthusiasm is unclear even to Karo themselves, as Ebenezer's ambivalent statement suggests. How much was fear? How much was commitment? Karo Highlanders, who were touched lightly by the Dutch presence, would appear to have had little reason to oppose the reinstatement of colonial rule and little material with which to imagine the grand sweep of an archipelagic national community. Few were literate, and most had never traveled beyond the confines of their district. It may well be that they really wanted to take part, as Ebenezer said, but what did they think they were taking part in? What kind of collective identity might Karo have envisioned for themselves at the beginning of independence? For the most part, they had little sense either of Indonesia as a real or imagined entity, or even of Karo as an exclusive, perduring ethnic appellation. Freedom, as they imagined it, was delicious. It was the antithesis of feeling colonized. It was the opportunity to reopen old wounds, to redress old wrongs. It was a chance to step into a bright new future exemplified, as I said, by glass windows, airplanes, tractors, and transistor radios. Anthony Reid has characterized Indonesian nationalism as anti-imperial and argued that it was through what he calls the alchemy of revolution that an ascribed colonial identity, the Dutch inlander or native, was transformed into a passionately felt new community. The anti-imperial struggles of Southeast Asian decolonization in the Philippines, Vietnam, Burma, Indonesia, again quoting Reid, sacralized the new identities which had been charted on the map by the old empires, especially among the state-averse societies of the Southeast Asian uplands and elsewhere on the outskirts of state power. The colonial state was seen as an essentially alien but necessary construct which opened doors to a broader modernity than would otherwise be possible. The Indonesian state then took up the mantles of modernity and necessity that had been promised but not delivered by its colonial predecessors, both Dutch and Japanese, and attached them to a collective sense of national belonging. Thus Reid. Now, Reid's assessment is a good descriptive summary of events and outcomes during the Indonesian independence struggle, but it's less satisfying as an explanation of anti-imperial nationalisms in places like Karo land. Nationalist commitment was, for one thing, not evenly spread across the archipelago, or even across the many ethno-linguistic communities of northern Sumatra. Why did Karo respond to the call for national independence when other groups, most notably the Javanese plantation laborers, who were unquestionably the most exploited population in the region, did not? Why did they take a more radical stance than their more cosmopolitan, better educated Toba Batak neighbors? What significance could national belonging have had for people whose relations with neighboring groups had as often been characterized by enmity as cooperation? What kind of passionately felt community could they have imagined? What did independence mean to them? What, in other words, was this strange alchemy of revolution? This is what political scientists refer to as a puzzle, a seemingly paradoxical situation or event that may serve to illuminate aspects of more general phenomena. In this case, the nature of decolonization, peasant political consciousness, mass violence, and the nationalisms of post-World War II Asia. There's no shortage of possible answers to this puzzle. Resistance from below is a well-worn topic in a range of disciplines and places, both historical and contemporary. Slave revolts and peasant uprisings, riots and crowds, millenarian and cargo cults, religious movements, royalist pretenders, supernatural signs and rumors, and prophecies of the world turned upside down have all been widely examined with an equally wide range of explanations: psychological, political, economic, cultural, sociological. In some cases, they're said to be the outcome of external pressures such as global economic forces, national or international politics, the intensification of state power, in the absence of intermediary mechanisms capable of alleviating such damages, or of the joint production of political cleavages at the national and local level. In others, the explanation is located in the psychic disruptions of colonialism, the anxieties of modernity, the collapse of state authority, the contradictions of capitalist exploitation, the misconstrued message of Christian missions, or any of a range of other forces. You could say that there are too many explanations here rather than too few, so that it's possible to select from the menu of options and find an explanatory fit in virtually any given case. And many of these can be applied, at least in part, to the Karo case. But where a political scientist might aim to solve the puzzle of popular mobilization in Karo land, I want to retain that sense of puzzlement, to use it as a guide in tracking both the unaccounted for events of the independence struggle and the memories and stories that have been produced around them. This means regarding stories as more than just sites for information retrieval or strategic positioning. It means attending to their form as well as their content, to the shape that memory takes in narrative, to the layers of interpretation through which it is pressed, the way it circles and circulates, how it escapes, is recaptured and escapes again, or doesn't. In this, I align myself at least halfway with Benedict Anderson's classic Imagined Communities, which argues that nations and nationalisms are cultural artifacts. To understand them properly, Anderson says, we need to consider carefully how they've come into historical being, in what ways their meanings have changed over time, and why, today, they command such profound emotional legitimacy. As is well known, Anderson identifies the source of nationalist thought in a complex crossing of discrete historical forces in 18th century Europe. These forces include the decline of monarchy, the rise of print capitalism, and the emergence of the concept of temporal simultaneity or homogeneous empty time. This conceptual platform could then be transplanted in modular form to, as he puts it, a great many social terrains, most notably via the last wave nationalisms of Europe's colonial empires in the second half of the 20th century. Now, Anderson lays out a plausible case for the origins and spreads of the idea of nationalism, how, for instance, the concept of the nation could appear to political philosophers, scholars, and movement leaders, but stop short of accounting for the willingness of an entire population, especially those situated on the nation's outskirts, not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginations. How, in short, does nationalism catch on in the first place, not just as an intellectual project, but as a deeply felt reality, a community of attachments, of shared being and belonging, especially among those who are perhaps not readers of newspapers or novels, or not among the tender pilgrims moving up the educational or administrative pyramid of the colonial state? Today, I want to approach these issues via a peculiar subset of Karo narratives that display what I somewhat playfully describe here as alimentary nationalism. That is, these are stories that use food as an idiom to communicate, display, disturb, or limit the extent of national belonging or communal imagining. Karo's stories about food could be patriotic or grotesque. They could be a measure of self-sacrifice, shared hardship, terror, or self-interest. They could expand the limits of sociality or signify a world turned upside down. One thing that made them interesting to me is that, like most of the stories about the independence struggle that I collected, they didn't contradict, but neither did they exactly coincide with official histories of the struggle. I'm going to present a range of these accounts, then turn in the end to perhaps overly brief discussion of their broader implications for theories of nationalism, in particular for such top-down, textually based models as imagined communities. But first, I want to take a detour into the art of ethnographic listening. Appropriately, it takes the form of a story. And here's where the elephant comes in. But like now, say, which would taste better, elephant meat or beef? Laughter cut through the heavy air like a breeze from the mountains. It was mid-afternoon when the Stepu household, my adopted family, usually drowsed in the muggy lowland heat before a round of cool baths and fresh clothes refreshed us for dinner, outings, or evening visitors. The voices seemed to be coming from what we called our project office that had been set up in an unused windowless study at the front of the house. 2 large desks were squeezed into the tiny space and 2 computers set up for transcribing interviews. With a couple of chairs, a printer, 2 cheap tape recorders for transcribing interviews, mic cameras and recording equipment, boxes of audio and video cassettes, and a rotating fan that just barely moved the heavy air, there was hardly room for anyone to squeeze in, let alone the 5 people I found there. My Karo sisters, Chichi and Nova, were hard at work with their younger sister, Ninin, their cousin, Helmi, and my assistant, Fariana, tucked up on the floor. "What's so funny?" I asked, poking my head in the doorway. "Hey, sis," Chichi responded casually. "It's nothing. We were just working on this interview." A few more giggles percolated up from the floor. Chichi slipped her headphones back on. Almost immediately she cried, "Oh no, she's doing it again!" Then after a pause, "Sis, who is this person? Why did you let her hijack your interview like that?" She rewound the tape and unplugged her headphones. "Listen to this." A girl's voice rolled tinnily from the tape recorder's small speakers. "So is that the only way to kill an elephant?" she said. They all shrieked with laughter again. I remembered the interview well. It was with a woman by the name of Nande Wajib, who had worked as a nurse in the Gunung Sitember field hospital in the forested area near the Karo district border. Ninin and I had gone alone to her place just outside Medan because none of our usual crew had been free that afternoon. A teenage girl was staying with her at the time, a niece or maybe a granddaughter, who joined us during the course of the interview. I didn't write down her real name, but will, for expository purposes, call her Sunkun Burita, which is the Karo term for asking for news. Relatives, neighbors, and passers-by, young and old, often sat in on our interviews, and sometimes they would ask a question or two of their own. I usually welcomed these uninvited audiences. Karo storytelling is an interlocutionary event in which listeners' questions, comments, and emphatic echoes of lines of dialogue push the action forward, call for elaboration of details in a conventionally spare plot line, or even create an opening for another story. These audiences created a comfortable and stimulating context for storytelling, provoked recollection, and gave us a sense of which topics excited interest and which were considered uninteresting, inappropriate, or irrelevant. They kept the conversation going and sometimes probed for details we wouldn't have known to ask for. Not everyone was an equally skilled interlocutor, however. Nova and Chichi, who were trained respectively in the practical sciences of agronomy and engineering, complained that Sunkun Burita's questions were just random, sembarangan. "How could someone get run over by a tank?" she asked. "Couldn't they get out of the way? Don't tanks have brakes? How many people did the hospital hold? Where did the medicines come from? Didn't you get paid? How does elephant meat taste? Is that the only way to kill an elephant?" Rather than facilitating the flow of narration, inquiries like these blocked, or as Chichi said, hijacked it. Ironically, the more interested she was in a subject, the more questions she asked. By that measure, it was the story of Nande Wajib's encounter with the elephant that most thoroughly captured her imagination. So here's the story. Nande Wajib. "One time we did have a chance to eat meat because this soldier shot an elephant. There was an elephant that was shot. They just roasted the elephant meat on a fire. When the elephant came, this guy was waiting for it. If the elephant spotted us, we'd be dead from him chasing us, so several people got ready." Sunkun Burita. "How did they kill it?" Nande Wajib. "Shot it." "If it's shot, is it sure to die?" Nande Wajib. "Yeah, if it's hit, you can kill it. It was killed, but its baby wasn't killed. The baby lay there beside its mama. We felt sorry for it, a newborn baby from the look of it, but as big as the biggest ox. meaning that even though it's not small, it had just been born. So its dead mama was just lying there, was standing beside her. They cut it up, divided the meat with the local people. Sukhumbrita. Didn't the baby get mad? Nani Wajib. What did he know about getting mad? He was still little. So the baby was cut up too. The baby's meat was tastier than the mother's because what do you call them? The elephant's tendons are really big. Sukhumbrita. Was the elephant meat tasty? Good enough. It was like beef. Me. If you've been eating nothing but yams for a year, well, it's tasty, right? Nani Wajib. It was good enough. Sukhumbrita. But now, compared to now, which tastes better, elephant meat or beef? Nandi Wajib. Beef is better. How can an elephant be good to eat? Because elephants work hard. Whenever they pass by, soo, that's the sound they make. Not just one of them passes by, they travel in big groups. So if they go by, or if we know they want to go by because their sound is really strong, so these people waited for them. So what do you do when they go by, says Sukhumbrita. Nandi Wajib. You hide. If they catch your scent, they'll chase you. When they run like this. They go straight ahead like this. They go on straight for a long way. Then they turn around, straight again. So if you want to get away from them, you've got to dodge over there. If you run like this, straight ahead, they'll chase you till they catch you. That's not the way to get away from them, said Sukhumbrita. You cut across their path, right? Nani Wajib. Yeah, crossways. If we see they're running over that way, we go the other way. Don't run straight, because with elephants, they run straight. Sukhumbrita. So running around in circles, how about that? They can't do that, right? Nandi Wajib. They can't do it because they're so big, so they can't turn in circles. They just run straight a long way. Then they come back. That's how we can get away from them. But once there was a man who said he couldn't get away from them anymore because he was cut up with razor grass, because it was all underbrush, all weeds. Well, it was guerrilla style. We were in the forest, In the forest, how could you keep anything clean? There were lots of chili plants in the woods. That's how it was there. Sukhumbrita. So the elephant meat was divided up with the people who lived there, right? Nandi Wajib. Yeah, we shared it with them. 1 tumba per household. Sometimes if it was a big family, we gave them 2. Sukhumbrita. So that's the only way to kill an elephant. Nandi Wajib. Yeah, shoot them. Dead, she fell. The others all ran away. Well, they were startled, She was dead. Sukhumbrita. So you shoot from 2 directions? Nandi Wajib. 1 direction. If you shoot from 2 directions, well, you might hit each other. Shoot like this. Well, one could miss the target. If everyone shoots at once from here, then he might fall with a crash. Because of that, he'll crash down. We didn't do it from 2 directions, from this 1 direction. Sukhumbrita. When the elephant was killed, how many people were shooting? That day, maybe 5 people. I don't remember too well. That's when you finally got to eat meat, huh? A big celebration. Nandi Wajib. Yeah, otherwise there wasn't any at all. Near the interview's end, Sukhumbrita tried to capture the thrill of dangerous encounters and strange foods by asking whether they'd ever eaten snake meat. No, never, required Nandi Wajib firmly. Why in the world would we eat snake? Oh, no. Now, I sometimes thought that a Karo history of the independence struggle could be constructed entirely from stories about food. So frequently did they occur in our interviews. Stories about food illuminated commitments to the nationalist cause and lapses in military discipline, the expansive reach of hospitality, the struggles of displacement, the limits of social personhood, the horror of mass killings and the violence of wartime, the disorder and sort of a time out of joint. They shorthanded a sense of shared privation, marked the boundaries of community, or keyed in a mood of wartime nostalgia. They grounded concepts like patriotism, sacrifice, and community in memories of concrete, sensuous experience, the taste of a saltless meal, the toughness of meat, the color of rice, the labor of meal preparation, making them in the process something shared and deeply felt. Just about anything that happened could be given extra narrative weight by associating with food, and whenever food was mentioned, you could be sure that you were being told something important. As Nandi Wajib's story of the elephant suggests, they could also be hijacked by the interests and intentions of a present-day audience, often in ways more subtle than Sukhumbrita's persistent questioning. People reflecting on hard times have a lot to say about what there was to eat, how it was gotten, who was generous and who was not. Karo women who were responsible for most of the farming and cooking, and even in ordinary circumstances, farming and cooking, even in ordinary circumstances, put particular emphasis on the gathering, preparing, and sharing of food. And while food is not ordinarily a topic of much interest, either in everyday Karo conversation or in the legends and folktales that comprise a local history of Karo social life, the sharing of food plays a large part in the delineation of kinship roles and statuses, as well as in broader notions of hospitality and generosity. So it was not particularly surprising that Karo men and women staged the moral lessons of independence in terms of the making and sharing of food. In stories of the Japanese occupation which preceded the independence struggle, the unequal distribution of food exposes the hollowness of Japanese claims of brotherhood. We call the Japanese our older brothers, schoolteacher Muham told us, but in the end, they kept the good rice, we got the yams. Here's how bad it was, Nande Timur complained. The Japanese fed rice to the pigs and forced toothless elders to eat coarse, hard feed corn or even bird seed. Lunggang Bangun went to volunteer for Japanese military training, but realized that their promises of liberation were false when he saw Indonesian officer trainees reduced to eating dirty pumpkin laid on the ground, chopped up with a machete and served on a piece of coconut shell. In contrast to accounts of the hardship and deprivation of Japanese time, women's stories of the beginning of independence revel in abundance. In these, the giving and preparation of food is a sign of patriotic commitment. Schoolteacher Muham, an ardent nationalist propagandist, quoted one of her speeches to us. "Give us rice to feed our soldiers," she said. "Otherwise, how will our soldiers eat? If there are tomatoes, peppers, vegetables, onions in your fields, bring them here, so our soldiers at the front lines don't have to go hungry." Everyone was happy to give, she said, even if all their rice went to feed the soldiers. This is Chick Muham. At the beginning of independence, everything was tough. There was no money, nothing. Even bullets, you know, the only way to get them was by stealing. There was just nothing. Only spirit that was brimming over. In terms of spirit, there was no one who mumbled, no one who grumbled. Everyone was happy, even if their rice all went to feed the soldiers. Tomatoes, peppers, whatever there was in the village, they gave it all to feed the soldiers. Yeah, all of them helped like that. Another woman, Nande Mandasa, recalled the work the village girls had to do when soldiers came to the village. Back then there wasn't any rice. We'd all beg for rice at the houses. One would give us 2 tumbas, 3 tumbas like that at the beginning of independence to feed those who fought the enemy. Then pound it at night. Even at night you'd pound it. So then when someone came, called, the ones who were to be fed, you'd ask for rice at the houses. There wasn't any husked rice. There wasn't a mill. Pound it like that, then cook it. We wouldn't get to sleep before dawn if someone came who had to be fed. So then, what to fix to go with it? If nothing was cooked, you'd get something from the house again. Well, pound the rice, make the stew. Nothing was off limits. You'd catch somebody's chicken or somebody's pig. They weren't off limits. "Did you know these soldiers, Granny? Were they from around here?" my assistant Jabatine asked. "They were from other places," she said. "If they were from around here, well, wouldn't we know them already? Know how we were related to them?" She meant that if the soldiers had been related, however distantly, to anyone in the village, then it would have been up to their local kinfolk to feed and house them. Sometimes they said the ones to be fed came from Medan. We didn't even know them. We didn't have a chance to find out how we were related. What else could you do? Soon they'd move on to someplace else. That was the problem. Tomorrow others would come too. In Nande Madasa's account, the flood of transient and undifferentiated freedom fighters becomes the narrative condition for an idealized depiction of communal harmony and generosity. Karo are obliged by social practice and by custom to take care of even the most distant of kin, but here kinship doesn't matter, and no one's livestock is off limits. Whoever comes should be fed. Nor is the feeding of the soldiers from elsewhere an occasional or extraordinary occurrence. It is what happens seemingly every day. Tomorrow others will come too. The designation of these soldiers as neither relatives nor non-relatives marks them as extraordinary, and the food they receive as freely given. The moral significance of food is clear in accounts like these, in which the national community is not so much imagined as it is instantiated through face-to-face practices of generosity and hospitality, or, in the case of stories of Japanese time, the inverse of such practices taught people how it feels to be colonized. Soldiers who were the beneficiaries of village hospitality sometimes had different stories to tell, qualifying the virtue of village generosity with its tendency toward parochial thinking. One man noted, for instance, that soldiers stationed near a village might not be fed if they didn't engage with the enemy. If we didn't fight, they would get stubborn, and finally they wouldn't give us anything to eat. So at a minimum, we had to fight once in every 3 days. We had to run around looking for fights. Another told how he'd gotten in trouble with his commanding officer when well-meaning villagers repeatedly served pork to a squad of Muslim Achinese fighters who deserted their posts in disgust over this treatment. It wasn't my fault, he explained. It was the fault of the villagers not understanding. Another soldier, this one himself Achinese, recounted with patronizing humor some of the strange food items he and his troops encountered in Karo land. Chipra, which is a cornmeal gravy that, according to him, looked just like your morning shit. A resemblance enhanced by its being served in what appeared to be a chamber pot. Tritis, a stew made of the partly digested contents of a cow's rumen, which tasted exactly like it sounds, and, as he said, absolutely could not be eaten. And bohan, which is seasoned congealed blood roasted in bamboo tubes, which provoked a bemused response. Different fields, different grasshoppers. There certainly are a variety of traditional foods that can be found in our nation. One of the most common food stories told by soldiers had to do with the red rice of the Maidan Front, the term used for the nationalist militia encampments blockading the lowland capital. Now I'm going to tell you something I'll bet you've never heard before, said Bapa Ruth Ginting, our sometime travel guide, reflecting on his time at the front. The rice they gave us at the front, it was red. It was wrapped in teak leaves, you see, each portion, and the leaves stained the rice. They turned it red. That's what I remember about the food at the front. Bapa Ruth's claim to originality notwithstanding, just about every Karo man who served in the popular militias mentioned the red rice of the Maidan Front to us. It was a sensuous hook that seemed to capture the essence of life at the front, a mix of estrangement and routine that could cast a defamiliarizing glare on something as ordinary as a packaged meal of rice. No doubt the rice wasn't always red, though the former soldiers, in a rush of nostalgic remembrance, recalled it that way. Maidan street-side vendors and food shops commonly served, and many still do, individual meals wrapped in banana leaves. But because of the number of servings that had to be prepared every day for the soldiers, and this is what's being depicted there, at the front, alternative wrappers had to be found. When the teak trees that lined the main highway to the city were cut down to block the road, their large leaves were put to use in the public kitchens where soldiers' meals were prepared. The kitchens were overseen by staff officers or more often by their wives. Karo girls from nearby villages sometimes helped out, but most of the work was done by Javanese estate laborers. They cooked the rice, topped it with boiled cassava leaves or stews made with vegetables trucked down from the highlands, and folded each individual portion in a leaf wrapper. Militia leaders notified the kitchen staff of their unit's position and current strength, which varied considerably from day to day, and the correct number of ready-made meals in their red-stained, teak-wrapped packages would be delivered to them. The unexpected redness of the soldiers' rice contains, but does not draw attention to, this entire backstage apparatus of food collection, preparation, and distribution, which linked uplands and lowlands, home fronts and front lines, the labor of women, and the battles of men. It also hints at, but does not display, other less attractive aspects of military mobilization, such as the exploitation of plantation laborers, crop levies on farmers, appropriations and downright theft of property from civilians, political infighting and competition between armed units over strategic resources. These are subsumed by the nostalgic pleasures of sensuous recollection, the minor strangenesses of wartime experience, and the triumph of military discipline over civilian disorder that is the basis of Indonesia's contemporary culture of violence to the present. When it comes to the military campaigns of the Revolutie Physique, or the physical revolution, a term that distinguishes the actual periods of fighting against the Dutch from the internal violence of the 1946 social revolution, and particularly the evacuation of the Highlands as Dutch troops swept through the region, Karo's stories about food take on an unsettled, anxious tone. In these stories, food is not something you can count on. The evacuation has become an iconic moment in the Karo social imaginary, in which it signals a profound break with the past and a first step in the move to modernity. It was a time of traveling in unfamiliar, often dangerous places, of encountering strangers and being compelled to adapt to their ways, of coping with scarcity, uncertainty, terror, and unpredictable violence. Villages were burned either by their inhabitants or by popular militias, or, in some cases, by Dutch military units. It was a time when communities were scattered, as they said, like the seeds of Job's tears when it's beaten. And life passages, marriage, death, and birth could not be celebrated or commemorated in the customary way. Stories of this time reflect on the human condition in extreme circumstances, when hospitality fails, when strangeness is commonplace and the requirements of sociality are unmanageable. Seemingly trivial manners take on an added weight. Food was strange, uncanny, unsavory, not quite fit for human consumption. No salt, Karo said, referencing the salt embargo set up by the Dutch and describing how food had no taste without it. We ate baywan, people told me over and over. You know what baywan is, don't you? Then they would describe this hardy weed, how it looks, how it has to be cooked, what it tasted like. These experiences were shared, and when they came up, as they almost always did in group conversations, everyone would nod knowingly. Yes, that's right. We did that too. That's just how it was. Evacuees told stories of having to flee Dutch attacks while their rice was half cooked. We took it off the fire and ran away. We ate it just like that, and it seemed good to us, if you're hungry enough. Or of arriving in villages where the refugees were not even allowed to borrow a spice mortar to prepare their meals. Sometimes these stories go further, unsettling the boundaries between the human and natural worlds. After a Dutch bombing raid, refugees discovered that a herdsman and his ox have both been blown up, with meat hanging from the tree branches, human and ox mixed together, and in their hunger and desperation, some people ate it anyway. Returning from the evacuation, villagers found that fish in the Boris River still, they said, tasted of the corpses that had been thrown there during the social revolution. It was years, they said, before you could eat those fish. They kept smelling like the corpses. Nandi Wajib's story of eating the elephant, despite the fact-finding efforts of her audience, dwells on the pathos of mother and baby killed together. We felt sorry for it, the baby elephant. Now here the narrative audience wobbles between the mother elephant as induk, as they described it, as dam, a term that's used for animal mothers, and mama, the intimate term for a human mother, mama or mommy even. So that they kind of move back and forth between referring to the elephant in one way as an animal and the other as a mummy. Nande Timur, who had also been at the Gunung Stember Hospital, told a different version of the story about the killing of the elephant. She didn't mention the baby, instead focusing on how this act had unsettled the natural order. Elephant, we even ate elephant meat at Gunung Stember. Right, it was really tough. It was shot, right? It was shot. So then it was divided up. One day, we cooked it all day, and it still wasn't soft. You couldn't cut it, that elephant. You couldn't eat it. It wasn't edible. It was really bitter. Then, because it was dead, the elephant, we were attacked by mosquitoes at that time. The elephants brought the mosquitoes into the village. It was like bees, the sound of the mosquitoes, because it was dead, the elephant. Another story that unsettled the human-natural distinction was told by Nande Ria, the wife of a militia commander who had spent nearly a year in a jungle camp near the village of Lo Primbon. There was a fellow in Lo Primbon who butchered a goat, she told us. They brought some meat. So then, what are you carrying, we said. Meat, he told us. We all grabbed that meat, ripped it up. We didn't roast it. We didn't grill it. We ate it just like that. That's why. If you haven't seen meat in a while, you know, your raw goat meat, we ate it right up because there wasn't anything to eat there. Well, roast it first? No way. No time to start a fire to roast the meat. We ate it blood and all. That's what happens when you're in the forest too long. I could go on with stories like these of humans acting like animals or animals regarded as quasi-human, of the hospitality that joins people in society, disregarded or perhaps worse, enacted but with dangerous, even fatal effects. But our time today is limited, probably gone on too long already. So let me turn quickly to my conclusions. I'll stop with that. When Karo women and men responded to the Gong of Independence in 1945, they did so in ways that had little, if anything, to do with Indonesia as a historically given national entity or even as a conceptually useful political object. The kind of community they imagined had to do with more intimate forms of comradeship, equality, and social justice, frequently exemplified in the sharing of food. Memory, as Maurice Halbach says, is an effect of community. It is constructed in dialogue, activated by interrogation, and framed by the conventions of narrative plausibility. Personal memory may be constricted by official limits on public discourse, by the formal shape of public commemoration and rituals of remembrance, or by the lack of interest of an interested or knowledgeable audience. But you could just as easily say that community is an effect of memory. The sense of national belonging in Karo land was neither the source nor the outcome of common experiences of hardship and aspiration, mobilization, evacuation, violence, or homecoming. Rather, it came about through the sharing of stories. The eating of baywan or the taste of a saltless meal does not in itself generate a sense of collective identity, but the recognition of the commonality of these experiences may do so. Now, I've referred here to what I call the memory of the senses to point to a certain powerful mode of recollection. Memory attaches itself most intensely to sensory experience. Taste, for instance, as I've described here, but also sight and sound, bodily states, smells. These are often small elements that evoke broader structures of feeling and remembrance. Even if the stories wrapped around them differ, a vivid shared sense memory can provoke a kind of collusive bonding. That's just how it was, people would say. We did that too. Karo nationalism in this sense had no beginning. It emerged retroactively as people shared stories of things that had happened to them during the independence struggle. Food, which engages the senses directly, but also carries a range of implicit social meanings, is a perfect vehicle for imagining the expanse as well as the limits of a community, whether it be national, ethnic, local, or indeed universal. But it was not the only one. Gender and sexuality, physical labor and bodily discipline or training, the extent of travels and the sense of place, acts of violence, and their tangible and intangible traces are some of the other sites in which the memory of the nation comes into being. Thank you very much.
The floor is open.
We have.
One of the things that has always struck me in other parts of Indonesia is the extent to which people are identified by what they will or will not eat. And the one thing you didn't mention, of course, is what Karo are most best known for: dog eaters.
No, that's Toba. They don't.
Really
Karo do not eat dogs.
Not the Karo, sorry, the Batak.
Bataks in general, yeah.
Are widely reputed to be dog eaters. But
these nuances are important, Webb. The nuances are important.
Yes,
Nobody outside of Karo land would recognize that issue, though. Okay, anyway, continue, please.
Yeah. So I wonder if you can, cutting across. So on the one hand, you have a story about what is special about a time of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
What's special about a time of trouble are things like deprivation and the horrible things you have to eat. Cutting across is another dimension, which is a kind of the moral emotions of disgust, revulsion, attraction that go along with the things you will or will not do, which person you are. And I wonder if you can say something about how this plays. You know, you mentioned the serving pork to the Achinese.
Yeah.
If you could reflect on the way in which, say, Highland and Lowland, or Toba versus Karo, Batak versus Minangkabau, or how the sense of a kind of a moral personhood might be inflected through stories of disgust and attraction.
Karo eat almost everything, and they talk about it that way. And the anthropologist who works among the Karo winds up eating almost everything too. So disgust is not something. Well, it is, but that's more of it's more of a kind of modern experience. A treatise in particular, which is this stew made from the contents of the second stomach, I believe, the half-digested grass. It's sort of halfway between grass and cow shit, and tastes exactly like you imagine. Everybody told me, well, if it's cooked right, it's delicious, and I can't say because I obviously never had it cooked right, but I developed, because, following the anthropological principle of you eat what you're given, I ate it. The story circulated throughout Karo land that this is the foreigner who eats treatise, and so it got served to me a lot. And people would say things like, our kids won't even eat this. So there's a kind of, generational, people who've gone to the city who are modern don't eat these foods, and some of them are fairly gross. What people talked about more than disgust was tastelessness. The weeds that you had to eat, the lack of salt, that was what they talked about. They didn't talk about, these are not gourmets. Karo just don't talk about food, and they don't, have very sophisticated culinary skills. So I would say that disgust was not something I really came across. People didn't talk about, except for the case of the man and the ox that were blown up together. That one, what I heard about that was, ew, it was disgusting. Some people ate it, even so, even though there might have been human meat in there. So, it's the line between the human and the animal, or, it was, we were so hungry we ate goat meat uncooked, we ate raw meat. That seems to be where the real dividing line, the rest of it was just there wasn't enough to eat. But where you do get that questions of disgust are precisely from outsiders coming into Karo land, and that was one reason I wanted to share those sets of stories, which were from soldiers who was non-Karo soldiers who were stationed in the area. And it was particularly interesting because it wasn't just that that they were served pork, one story, but that they were fed things that were disgusting. It was chipra, which is actually quite good. It's basically toasted cornmeal gravy with chicken odd parts put in it. It's really quite good, but it does look as they described it. So that was, so there's a kind of city versus country. The more urbane soldiers who were coming into the area found peasant food to be gross and revolting in certain ways.
But that is, it's not so much a culinary characterization as it is a kind of a moral one.
It is, absolutely.
Morally disgusting things.
Yes.
And that so people who are willing to eat with us, like you, are bonded with us in a way, in part because they won't reject what we do.
Well, so that's why you do it, right?
But it's a very important issue for a lot of people.
Yeah. Nancy.
This is getting to the puzzlement that you want to leave behind, but I'm curious about why the Japanese estate workers did not self-mobilize, and if they didn't self-mobilize, how were the women estate workers brought in to cook? Forced. Okay.
Yeah,
So
they were forced to do it, basically.
Suppose they didn't self-mobilize that particular group of.
Well, that's a good. Yeah, I know it's very puzzling to me. I mean, both of those groups. I mean, the Toba, who were much more um, better educated, who had more of the Andersonian criteria for, a kind of national consciousness, were much more conservative in their relation to the nationalist movement. They were more kind of aligned with the royalist Malays in the coast. The Javanese are a bit of a puzzle, and it may just be because they were so oppressed to begin with that that it was sort of oppression that went beyond resentment, whereas the Karo were just kind of generally pissed off at the Dutch because they didn't get enough respect. But the Javanese were really forced into extremely impoverished circumstances, and then they became a kind of mobilizable backstage workforce for military groups and militias as well. So it's not that no Javanese ever became involved, but it tended to be more not the plantation workers, but either people who were in this class of Preman, of former plantation workers who were now day laborers in the city, or petty criminals and so on, or relatively educated people. But the masses, the Javanese were the largest ethnic population in East Sumatra at the time, but they were also the poorest. And they were the least involved in most of this, which is just extremely curious to me. I mean, the other large group that was not involved, particularly aside from the Malays, were the Chinese, but the reasons there are, I think, fairly obvious. That they were exploited and oppressed immediately by the militias as they were forming. But yeah, I mean, it's just you would think that there would be a kind of natural constituency, exactly, among those people who had really experienced not just the 3 years of Japanese difficulties, but 40 years of plantation, extreme forms of plantation labor. Yeah.
Let me address that last thing and then make a segue, which is a related question. I would say that you're definitely right that they by that time just had enough and had experienced oppression by those two periods, the end of the colonial regime, and they probably distrusted any other outside rising power, including the nationalists. Their head down, I think. But in that line, it seems natural that in the recollections that you were recounting, you would see a lot of emphasis on the common efforts, and on the provision of supplies and food by whomever. But we also know that some of the militias became very predatory, and you also alluded to that briefly. And I just was wondering how much of that aspect crept through in the narratives, in terms of, and if it did, was it presented in terms of guilt at having participated in predatory collections, or in some other way, or as a resentment for having to have.
The easy answer is no, it did not. I had to dig that out for myself, either through rather direct questioning or from going to written sources. People did not talk about this. They did not. I had to really dig to get a sense of how the distribution of food was organized within the militias or within the army units. That wasn't I mean, they would tell you it wasn't a problem. It was like, okay, you count your men. You have to. Well, this was where it came up. They would say things like, well, you had to count the men in your squad every day because people were deserting all the time and going away, and others were joining up. So you never knew how many people you had. So you had to count them every day and then send the information ahead. So they would talk about things like that, or about the techniques of distribution and things like that. But the deployment of not entirely voluntary labor, let's say, was almost unmentioned at any level by anyone. And so that's something that's, you have to find that elsewhere. But
Were there any reactions in the occasions that you may have pressed that question directly, or did you choose not to?
well, I didn't say to people, so did you exploit the Javanese? No, I didn't say things like that, but it was more, how did you do this? And they would say, oh, the Javanese women came and did this work. They didn't just come and do the work, they had to come and do the work. Or they were probably paid a little bit, and given that the plantations were now non-functioning, they had no other source of income. But I think you're kind of right on target about this question of, well, did they trust the nationalists? Maybe not. Were they distrustful perhaps because the mid-level plantation supervisors, their direct supervisors, were not Dutch? They were from other native groups, either Malay or sometimes Javanese, but more often from the educated Toba or other Batak groups. Not so much Karo, because Karo just didn't want to work for the Dutch. But so you've got, the level of distrust. And there's also, I think, a kind of fear that what if this doesn't work? What if this fails? So there was a kind of pessimism would be another issue here that I would suspect. And it's just sort of like, this is not our fight. We're not going to... Yeah. I mean, I wonder about how the masses of the population in Java engaged with the struggle, probably in some of the same ways. It's just sort of leave me out of this. This is not, it's going to be one boss or another boss. What's the point? I mean, you see some of that, for example, in Pramudya's stories. Some of that sense of the distinction between an elite who are committed to the nationalist cause and then particularly the rural masses who seem not to be too clear on what's going on.
When elephants fight,
Yeah, exactly. The really odd story here is not why rural Javanese didn't get involved, but rather why it is that Karo, from the top to the bottom, were completely, with a few exceptions, completely committed to this cause that they really didn't understand. And why is that? Part of it has to do with the way that militia leaders deployed a philosophy-based, kinship-based philosophy of struggle, that it's one for all and all for one, and the fact that you had an extremely egalitarian society where status hierarchy is always flexible, and so you don't have an absolute bottom and an absolute top. But still, I mean, it's puzzling and perplexing. But in a situation like this, to come up with a single explanatory mechanism really, I think, doesn't take you very far, and is much more helpful, I guess, to try to stick with that sense of, they weren't quite sure why they were doing this either, or looking back, what was it that we were doing? What do we think we were doing? And the explanations, even when I was doing the interviews in 1995 with people who were quite old at that point, were not entirely sure. They knew they'd been committed, that they had really gotten involved, and at the same time not entirely clear on what it was that they were doing. I should add, before that next question, that another factor is that, unlike most everywhere else, including, I believe, much of Java, there was intensive fighting going on in rural areas in East Sumatra throughout the period of the struggle, and particularly in two intensive military campaigns. The reason for that is that East Sumatra had a huge number of natural resources that were extremely important for the Dutch to control. The plantations, tobacco and palm oil plantations in particular, oil in near the Achinese border and other things. It was one of the areas where they could see a clear economic advantage in holding on to it, and so they were determined. It was one of the places that they really wanted to keep. So probably Central Java and East Sumatra. And so there was a lot of fighting that went on, and didn't just go on in the cities. It wasn't a matter of control the cities and everything will be fine. This was a case where they had to control the hinterlands as well, and with a fairly small force that couldn't just stay in the cities and the larger towns, had to move out and try to control the roads, and didn't actually succeed very well either in that. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just comment to what extent some of the tropes of nationalist historiography colored some of these narratives, whether you would notice things that seemed really clearly to be sort of signposts that had emerged as that history, that broader national history had been shaped. And then one other quick question is if you could talk a little bit more about some of the resonances of the specific weeds that people were, because there's this iconic notion of being forced to eat weeds, and especially in Indonesia, right? There's other weeds that have these resonances.
Well, that's interesting, the weed part, because there are a lot of weeds that are delicacies. But Baywan apparently, and I never could quite figure out what Baywan was, but it was something that was not, it must have been all over the place, but it was not particularly tasty. And there were plenty, wild foods are common, but this was one that, and it was so specific, and everybody mentioned it. We had to eat Baywan, and then everyone said, we did too. So it was a kind of real trope of, extreme deprivation, as that's how far it all went. But why that would be when, the idea of eating wild greens was Karo really into vegetables. And greens in particular, they eat tons of different kinds. But this one was kind of beyond the pale. Nationalist historiography, not something I had a chance to talk about here, but clearly you can't have 40, 50 years of ideological indoctrination without some impact. The government, I assume this is still the case, but certainly going up to 1995, which was the last time I was there on Independence Day, there were huge celebrations that were calibrated and coordinated throughout Indonesia, celebrating independence. And some of the paintings that I showed were details from the billboards that school kids would paint in annual contests. And so all of these things were very, very overdetermined by various kinds of interventions of that sort. My sense is that for older women in particular, and village women, a lot of the indoctrination didn't really reach that far. They were not subject in the same way to the kinds of intensive programs that kids got in school, for example, or that men got through veterans organizations. There was no women's veterans groups until the early 90s. And even then, it didn't go very far. Still, there were, the pension interview was one that clearly shaped a lot of men's stories. Asked, okay, tell me what you did during the struggle, and they would reel out this list of places that they had been and people that they knew that had died, presenting a whole series of factoids that would serve as proof of service, right? So they were producing these narratives as a kind of regular story, but it was clear that they had been shaped by that particular national discourse. The Independence Day celebrations were sort of surrounded by various kinds of artworks, the gateway, ceremonial gateways, the Gapura, and that were painted with the then and now, and then was ragged soldiers and with bamboo spears, and now was laboratories and skyscrapers and airplanes and people, families with 2 children. So, there was a lot of then and now. One of the things that I think that it has been sort of striking to me is the extent to which the independence struggle has had a decreasing significance throughout Indonesia, which is probably not surprising, since as the veterans die off or people who were there are not around to remember it anymore, or not so many. But still, you would think that that there would, at this point in time, there would be an interest in recovering the kinds of stories that people might tell about this, and sort of move away from, the 3 or 4 heroic figures and iconic battles, the Battle of Surabaya and the 6 Hours and Yogyakarta and, this sort of thing, and the Bandung Sea of Fire. But it seems not so much to be the case, for good or ill.
All right, I'm so sorry, but we are out of time for today. On behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, I'd like to thank you all for coming and hope that you have a wonderful weekend. But most of all, I would like to thank our